Hello and welcome to episode 103 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other posts. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing well, Seth. How are you?
I'm doing great. We got a lot to talk about today.
Sure do.
Today, we're going to be discussing one of the most polarizing figures in American military history, that being General Douglas MacArthur. During World War II, MacArthur was lauded by the American public and press. He was seen by many as a messiah, a description that he himself never once shrugged off as being false or overly exaggerated. He often stated publicly and privately that he was the only person that could ever possibly lead the United States to victory over the Japanese, that he himself should be the supreme commander, and that he himself was the only person who knew what the hell he was doing. And while admittedly not all of the failures in the Philippines can be pinned on MacArthur directly, a great many can. And what's more, the fall of the Philippines wasn't the only time in World War II or in his military career that this self-professed savior was anything but. From his deep hatred for the United States Navy to his messiah complex for leading the charge against Japan, MacArthur was not all he is cracked up to be, was he, Bill?
That's true, Seth. As you know, the nation is going through a process today of reviewing Confederate leaders through a clearer lens, clearing away the mythology around them that emerged to justify their actions. And these, excuses developed after the end of the Civil War as kind of a modification to history. And I see this relook as being right and appropriate. But I also think it's time to contemplate General MacArthur similarly through a clearer lens. And if we do this, we realize, number one, he was an unabashed liar, regularly committing what we would refer to at Annapolis as honor violations of the type that would have gotten any other military officer fired. Number two, he was a narcissist of the degree to which made General George Patton look like a humble man. Number three, he was self-delusional about his military prowess, as you said, Seth, believing that he and only he alone had the ability to win the war in a largely naval theater when his actions, in fact, likely extended that war. Number four, something that's often overlooked, he was a known pedophile who, at the age of 50, took in a 16-year-old girl as his live-in concubine. Number five, if that's not enough, as Army Chief of Staff, he used Army mounted cavalry and tanks against protesting World War I heroes in an event referred to as the bonus March demonstrations that occurred in Washington, D.C. So in my view, Seth, rather than being a military genius, for his part in the execution of questionable campaigns that contributed to the deaths of thousands of Americans, I see him as the worst American general since another General Mac, George McClellan. And about the only good thing I can say about him is he did perform admirably in World War I when he had far less responsibility than he did in World War II. And he did very well in his leadership of occupied Japan. That should not be overlooked. However, it doesn't erase his many, many deficiencies. Now, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, Seth, is going to sound like 2020 hindsight. But in the military, we have this process called the after action report, or AAR, that is 100% 2020 hindsight. The whole purpose of the AAR is to overcome the fog of war and the delusions that you kind of acquire about yourself during certain operations and look back on what really happened so that we can learn from it. And Seth, as we know, I know we call this podcast an unauthorized history of the Pacific War, but there is much to learn from this history today, particularly as it pertains to a potential future war in the Pacific, which seems increasingly likely to happen as every year passes. So, Seth, I know that's pretty harsh, but I think it's appropriate.
I don't think it's harsh, and I think if anybody's listening to it right now and thinks that, we're going to explain to them why it's not harsh. General MacArthur was as I said, and as you just said, he was lionized by the public, by the American government too, and he was put up on this pedestal, a pedestal that he created, mind you, and it was largely for reasons unknown to really anybody except for General MacArthur. I mean, he was put up on this pedestal and looked at as this god, and it just simply was completely false. Even though the
And
country needed heroes in 1942, they didn't need him.
no, that's right. And what had happened in reality was there was because MacArthur was so popular with the general public, there was one standard of behavior that was applied to MacArthur and another standard of behavior that was applied to everybody else. And time again, MacArthur was lionized, aggrandized for behavior that would have gotten anybody else fired. So let's take on the example of his performance before the war, Seth.
Go for it. Let's talk about, he was Army Chief of Staff. So, I mean, he doesn't just appear on the scene. I mean, he works his way up. He is in World War I. He's a World War I veteran himself, where he performed, as you said, admirably. I mean, heroically almost. I mean, or not almost, really he was. I mean,
did, yeah.
He put himself on the line and he proved his mettle there. However, it's after that seemingly someone hooked an air hose to his head and it just kept getting inflated bigger and bigger every day. He gets to the position of Army Chief of Staff, and what goes on from there, talking about the bonus march and things like that. Tell us about that.
Well, there is in World War I, veterans believed that they had been promised this bonus for serving, this cash bonus. And year after year, it was supposed to be paid out over a period of years, and they kept kicking the can on when it would be paid out. And these people during the Depression were, they were
destitute. Yeah,
destitute is exactly the right word. They were living in shanties, self-made shanties. They had no food. They had families, and they said, wait a minute, we served in the war, we served our country, we were promised this, and they decided, look, it's time that the government keep its promise, and they kind of gathered in DC and basically built a shanty town and said, since we have no place to live and the government's not keeping its commitment, we're going to live here. Now, President Hoover said, no, look, we got to disperse these people, and turned it over to the War Department to do that. But he explicitly stated, don't get too demonstrative when dispersing these World War I heroes. Don't go, beyond the pale. And MacArthur did exactly what Hoover told him not to do. And he brought the army in force, and a mounted cavalry, horse soldiers, and tanks, and basically would have run over these folks and scattered the demonstration. And these are troops some of which he himself had led during World War I, that he treated like so much fodder while he was trying to disperse them from these demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. And, he took a lot of heat over this. In a normal human being, the criticism that he received for this would cause you to say, you know what, I need to learn from this. Maybe I overstepped, I overreached. I need to, become a better leader because of this, right? But not this man.
No,
MacArthur did not learn a thing.
Not at all. And in fact, this is one of the first times that we know of that he directly disobeyed an order from a superior commander, this one being President Hoover. Hoover said, don't cross the Anacostia Bridge or the river and go across the bridge. And he directly disobeyed that, not once, but twice. He did it twice. And he was under orders to not really mess with the shanty town and basically just, get them off the Capitol lawn essentially and get them away from the Capitol building or the government buildings. And he went over there and he did exactly what he was told not to do. And this is the first time that we know of that he does these kind of things, where he basically just ignores orders from superior commanders or officers, or in this case, the commander in chief. And it's a pattern that starts to form after this. This is the first time, but it's certainly not the last time. He he does this, and this is truly a stain on. Well, President Hoover wasn't exactly the most well-liked president in history either. You know, people would walk around with their pockets hanging out, calling them, Hoover flags because they didn't have any
Right.
money in their pockets. And that's the Depression was certainly one of the reasons that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president after Hoover. But a lot of people put this specific action on one of the reasons that election was such a landslide. The bonus march and how Hoover, reacted to it afterwards.
Absolutely. But his egregious behavior didn't start when he was the Army Chief of Staff. He was, while stationed in the Philippines before he became the Army Chief of Staff, then 50-year-old MacArthur met the 16-year-old named Elizabeth Rosario Cooper, who was a Filipino film actress, who caught his eye. And in 1930, 50-year-old MacArthur moves this 16-year-old into his apartment with him, where she becomes his concubine. And if that isn't bad enough, I mean, that's clearly a case of pedophilia. It's, he's a pedophile. When he becomes chief of staff and is transferred back to Washington, he brings her with him and puts him up in an apartment in Georgetown. And in the book American Caesar by William Manchester, I mean, this is clearly documented. It was known about by reporters at the time, contemporaneously. But William Manchester says he showered Cooper with presents and bought her many lacy tea gowns, but no raincoat. She didn't need one, he told her, because her duty lay in bed. A Washington Post reporter named Drew Pearson was about to expose this affair. And it so happens that Pearson was being sued by MacArthur for libel, for other things that he said about the bonus march event, right? And so Pearson published true stories about bonus march. MacArthur was suing him for libel, even though the stories were true. And Pearson finds out about this 16-year-old concubine and threatens, basically blackmails MacArthur. If you continue to sue me, I'm going to print this story. Something that never happened back then. I mean, American leaders through the Kennedy years, right, were protected by reporters. And so MacArthur ended up having to dump Rosario Cooper, Elizabeth Cooper, and she stayed in the United States until 1960 when she committed suicide. But I mean, another egregious form of behavior that a lot of Americans and American military members knew about, that was simply tolerated from him. And maybe this was relatively common back then, but not among senior officers. And so
another, not anyway.
Exactly. And so another, area where leadership just turned a blind eye to his missteps.
Yeah, that's beyond, frankly, disgusting. And he was married at the time, was he not?
Well, he had just gotten divorced when he moved the 16-year-old in with him. But I mean, this was criminal activity.
Sure.
This is not merely bad behavior. This is criminal. And that is something that I think the United States, and I was going to save this for later, but I'm going to say it now. There's still a lot of monuments and tributes to MacArthur at West Point in the city of Norfolk, where the MacArthur Memorial is. And just like we're rethinking Confederate memorials, I believe it's time for West Point and the city of Norfolk to rethink their MacArthur monuments for this and other reasons we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, he's certainly not the shining star that he was portrayed to be, and he wasn't. It wasn't just me and you saying this. It was a lot of other people saying this, and a lot of people that are very famous in American history. One specifically being future president, former general Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower served under MacArthur in Washington and in the Philippines, didn't he?
Yeah, it was a total of, I think, 6 or 7 years. I think I called it his time in purgatory. It was until MacArthur kept holding them back, holding them away from more senior duties and command in order to keep him from getting promoted. That was one of MacArthur's modus operandi, is that he would take people that he knew were talented and he would suck them into his domain and then hold them there, even when it meant that those people were avoiding opportunities to get promoted. Eisenhower finally, knowing about MacArthur's bad behavior, close to blackmailed MacArthur himself in order to get transferred back to Washington and out of MacArthur's domain. But, you know, from time he was a major, so again, MacArthur was a 4-star general, and Eisenhower was a major on his staff when he was chief of staff in Washington. He worked for the Secretary of War first, but then MacArthur pulled him into his, you know, orbit while he was chief of staff. And of course, later they were both 5 stars together, with Eisenhower leading in Europe and MacArthur leading a bit of the Pacific theater. But Eisenhower knew the real MacArthur, not the fantasy MacArthur or the public's, you know, evaluation of MacArthur. Eisenhower knew about MacArthur's 16-year-old girlfriend. He knew everything, all the truth, and really couldn't stand the man.
Yeah, well, he wasn't the only one. There were several people, that we'll get to that in a little bit. Guys who, generals and people who served underneath him or served alongside of him in various positions, who loathed him.
Well, including Roosevelt, Marshall,
right,
Admiral King,
right,
Admiral Nimitz. You know, they realized, hey, look, we can't out this guy because the public thinks too highly of him.
Right.
During this time, we need heroes.
Right.
But we also have to figure out how to hold him at bay as well.
He was kind of a monster of FDR's own and the propaganda machine's own creation. And once they built that monster up to Godzilla-esque stature, they kind of had to live with him. You know, it's like, you know, you dig your own grave kind of a thing. You know, they built him into this figurehead, and you're stuck with him, you know.
Well, they had plenty of opportunities to correct that, though. I mean, one of MacArthur's many, many blatant, flat out lies, well, let's call it what it is, was when he claimed he was almost killed by a bomb on the Bataan Peninsula during, you know, obviously, you know, it was before he was evacuated from Bataan. And he had not even been to the Bataan Peninsula. There was widespread fighting. It was very dangerous. And at that point in time, where he claimed, he wrote a press release that claimed that General MacArthur was narrowly avoided being killed by this bomb that exploded 10 feet away from him, which was ludicrous. And again, there were so many opportunities for Roosevelt, Marshall to say, you know, dude, you need to start telling the truth, or stop lying at least.
Right.
And no, they never did. At least there's no record of it.
Well, let's talk about that. You talk about his press releases and his megalomania, which we could talk about for the rest of the day. But, you know, you mentioned his press releases, and that's exactly what they were. They were his press releases, because he had PR people, as do all Army posts and Navy. You know, every senior leader has a public affairs officer, and he was no different. However, he himself approved every single thing that went across his desk that mentioned him in a glorious way. If it didn't mention him by name
and or omit everybody else who might have contributed.
Correct. It didn't see the light of day. General George Kenney, who was his Army Air Force's liaison there, said that no press, and I quote, said, "No press communique saw the light of day unless it painted the general with a halo and seated him on the highest pedestal in the universe," unquote. So, I mean, this is his own guys saying this. And I mean, it's the truth. If you look at anything that came out of Southwest Pacific area, which was his theater, his area of influence, it all refers to him specifically, that he was the one leading the charge, as if he was up there at the very front, you know, literally up there with the troops saying, "Hey guys, go over here, you do this, and let's charge across this bridge," which of course we both know never happened. I don't think that he heard a shot fired in anger until 1944 when he landed in the Philippines, and we'll get to that later too.
Right.
But he certainly didn't lead the charge across the Pacific. Yet every single thing that he put out, and I say he because he was the ultimate authority on anything that came out of his theater, and it was him, and he admitted it. If it didn't paint him in a, you know,
glorious light,
Christ-like light, it did not go out. And woe betide the subordinate commander that had his name in the paper.
Yep, he would come down with both feet. Now, I hope we do another episode on Admiral King. And if we do, I would title it King Was Right About Almost Everything. And one of the things King was wrong about was his reluctance to send out press releases, because every naval victory in the Pacific, MacArthur would send out daily press releases describing how it was his victory. So Coral Sea, just everything MacArthur took credit for. And since King and Nimitz were very shy with the press, I don't know how else to describe it, reluctant to engage with the press, MacArthur was outpacing them. And the military expression is he got inside their OODA loop. So, on all of these, taking credit for all of these victories that he had nothing to do with. And again, out and out lies. But ethics and morals didn't mean anything to MacArthur.
Clearly not. But you say Coral Sea specifically, and this was something that it's, if you know anything about the Battle of Coral Sea, you know that the Army Air Forces, God bless them, did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. They
not
did,
for lack of effort.
But they did
didn't
nothing.
Have the technology to actually be effective against ships.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not saying they sat around, but they did nothing to contribute to the victory, strategic victory, mind you.
Also true for Midway, by the way.
Exactly. But they did nothing to contribute to the defeat of the Japanese in those events. Yes, did some of MacArthur's, did some of the B-17s under MacArthur's sphere fly recon missions? Yes. Did they try and do something? Yes. Did they do anything? No. They had nothing to do with it. It was Nimitz's people. It was Fletcher. It was Fitch. It was Lexington, Yorktown. We'll do a Coral Sea episode later. But yet MacArthur, after the event was over, MacArthur pinned the press release that it was his people, that it was his victory, and that never once mentioned the efforts of the Navy task forces that were there. So the people back home in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, are reading the paper going, wow, General MacArthur's really kicking the Japs behind. But it had nothing to do with him. And this is not the first time, and it certainly isn't the last.
And Roosevelt actually got aggravated with King and said, you need to start telling the Navy's story here, because it's looking like the Army is doing all of the winning out there in the Pacific, when in fact, at this point in time, again, it's not their fault. They were contributing very little that was moving the needle. Not that they weren't active, but they weren't contributing very little that was moving the needle in the effort to defeat Japan. Now later, big time, right? But in this early stage of the war, he was just lying about the contributions of his forces. But that's after the fall of the Philippines. Let's go back to the fall of the Philippines and talk about when he was evacuated. His fault. He was ordered to leave. I'm not going to blame him for that. And but this is one case where he, unlike Bonus March, actually elected to follow his orders, leaving the Philippines.
Very happily, I'm sure.
But he was, and it's ironic to me, the height of irony, that General Short, who had no warning about the attack on Pearl Harbor, is fired and pilloried for getting his forces destroyed. General MacArthur, who had plenty of warning before the Japanese attacked the Philippines, and yet gets all of his aircraft destroyed due to inaction, receives the Medal of Honor.
That he wrote.
That he and Marshall
partially wrote.
Yeah. So, and in fact, John McManus is in his book says, for a man of Marshall's integrity, it was an uncharacteristically dishonest moment, perhaps his worst as chief of staff. From any fair-minded viewpoint, the decoration was incredibly inappropriate and overtly political, if not downright appalling. It equated MacArthur's actions in evacuating from the Philippines with the likes of Nininger and Bianchi, two heroic soldiers who received the very first medals of honor in all of World War II, thus cheapening the immense value of the nation's highest military decoration, one reserved only for the most courageous, and the most self-sacrificing of soldiers, generally not given out for running away. So,
Very true.
it's incredible that, this happened, and so ironic when you think about how Kimmel and Short were treated.
And it's something that, you know, I find it to be disturbing that it was that he got the medal, first of all, because he certainly did not deserve it. Secondly, that the press and the American people ate it up. And I know they didn't know any better because, they think that if he gets the medal, then he deserved it. But it's punched up in wartime newsreels that came out of his theater of operations too, by the way. It's punched up in Hollywood movies of the day. They refer to him. They don't refer to Nimitz at all. They don't refer to even Halsey, who was also a headline grabber, but they didn't refer to Halsey. It was always MacArthur, MacArthur, MacArthur.
Posters in factories were all about MacArthur.
Yeah, I shall
right?
return and all this.
Even now, posters in factories building Navy ships were about MacArthur.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene, and you and I talked about this a long time ago. There's a scene in the movie Holiday Inn, which comes out and towards the beginning of the war, like 42 or something like that.
It predates White Christmas. Yeah, it was during the war.
Right. Yeah, and it's the first time you hear the song White Christmas. But regardless of this, there's a scene in the movie where it's the 4th of July in the movie, and Fred Astaire is doing some kind of dance routine or whatever, and in the background they're showing these heroic images of American ships and soldiers marching and airplanes flying, and it ends with this giant star in the middle of the screen. And who do you see? Douglas MacArthur.
Absolutely.
And he is literally, in this film, he's portrayed as like this Christ-like figure. You can see a sort of like light behind his head. It's bizarre. It's really bizarre. And it just stems from this image of himself that he perpetuated, that the people just ate up, and it's disgusting.
Well, we talk about lessons, right? The lesson here is if you have a public who's hungry for heroes, and you have somebody who's willing to lie about their own contribution and build themselves up as a hero, bad things can happen, right? You set the wrong people up as the icon of virtue. And MacArthur was exactly the opposite of an icon of virtue. Then let's talk about how he left the Philippines and essentially usurped President Roosevelt's authority.
Well, let's talk about that, and let's talk about some of the money he got from the Philippine government.
Well, that was right. That was after. Okay. Yeah. That happened just right after he left, right?
Right. It was, how much was it? It was a ton of cash.
It was equivalent of $7 million in today's currency out of the Philippine treasury.
Right.
So President Quezon, let's go back in history just a moment, because it's going to be germane to our conversation about why we retook the Philippines. Of course, we got the Philippines from Spain after that we won the Spanish-American War. And whereas Spain was an imperial nation who had colonies all over the world, South America, Cuba, and in this case, the Philippines, the United States, got in the colonization business, kind of backed into it by accident, by beating countries that had colonies, and then we kind of inherit them. Philippines was one of those. And, it was decided fairly early on, within 20 years or so of inheriting the Philippines, that, we don't want to be doing this. We have to protect this country. We're in the middle of a Great Depression. We can't even afford a military that size to defend the United States.
Right.
What are we doing building a military to defend the Philippines, right? And during this period of time, MacArthur was stationed in the Philippines. And so the United States developed this plan over time to return the Philippines to Philippine independence, Philippine rule. And so the United States started, the initiative to get the Filipinos to elect a Philippine president, create a Philippine treasury, a Philippine legislature. So all of those were elected, and the first Filipino president was President Quezon. And MacArthur, before the war, had been, after he was chief of staff, returned to the Philippines in a role that he created, which was field marshal of the Philippine Army. And of course, he created his own uniform, shark skin uniform, that was ludicrous, ostentatious. He looked like a banana republic, but he wore the hat from that uniform throughout World War II, even when he met with President Roosevelt, which became an issue for President Roosevelt because he knew that wasn't a proper Army uniform. In any case, he was being paid by both the United States Army, his retired pay, because by this time he was beyond the age of retirement for the United States Army, and by the Philippine Army. And he was earning the equivalent of, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in, today's dollars.
He wasn't hurting.
He was getting rich, is what he was getting, doing this as the Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. So leading up to the war, he was very, very well off. And then when he evacuated, they collected what they could of the Philippine treasury, cash from the Philippine government, and tried to evacuate as much as that as he could with him. Well, President Quezon, and again, I don't want to cast aspersions on what President Quezon thought of what he would do personally with the Philippine treasury that was evacuated from the Philippines. But of course, he got some of that money himself as well. Mm-hmm. But he shared it with General MacArthur to the tune of, in today's dollars, $7 million. Mm-hmm. And of course, the American government knew this was happening.
Right. FDR knew it. Yeah.
FDR knew and didn't do anything about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he was essentially given hush money. If you want to put it in today's, lexicon, MacArthur was given hush money, and FDR knew it. Marshall knew it. They were aware of the money changing hands, and nobody said or did a friggin' thing about it. Nobody did anything about it. He was paid to leave, and then when paid to fail.
And when he did leave, and again, he's being paid the $7 million as his troops are being massacred on Bataan.
Right.
And eventually, of course, this leads to the Bataan Death March.
Right.
So there's a Bataan Death March of General Wainwright and all of his soldiers, all of MacArthur's soldiers, and MacArthur is getting paid $7 million. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is beyond egregious. Again, West Point, this is the guy you want to hold up and put statues to. If we had statues like this towards anybody equivalent at Annapolis, I would be leading a campaign to get him taken down, but we don't. And I'm just horrified that West Point still aggrandizes this guy. Now, he leaves the Philippines and utters the famous phrase, "I shall return." What's wrong with that, Seth?
Well, it pigeonholes him. And it doesn't just pigeonhole him, it pigeonholes the entire Pacific War effort at that point and for the future.
He's usurping Roosevelt's authority as commander-in-chief of deciding what the right campaign objectives would be,
or at least at that time. There's record of you talked about President Quezon, and I don't want to get too much into the Philippines because we've already done that, but he talked about striking a deal with the Japanese to save himself and his people, and there's whatever, you can say what you want about that, I don't go for it, but regardless of this, FDR got a hold of this. He got wind of this, and MacArthur supported Quezon and his decision to do that. By the way, just be abundantly clear here. Mm-hmm. And FDR got wind of this, and FDR said, "Not a chance. This is not going to happen. You're not going to do this. Someday, one day, in the future, we, being the American people, will come back to the Philippines, and we will kick the Japanese out." He didn't say when. He didn't say how. Nothing like that. But once MacArthur said, now, of course, this was not known to the public. This never got out to the press, nothing that FDR said. But once MacArthur says it, it becomes an issue. Once he says, "I shall return," it becomes an issue with the American people for the rest of the war that we're going back to the Philippines.
It becomes de facto military strategy.
Yeah. And everything that MacArthur, drove towards after he said that, everything that he tried to do after he left the Philippines was to get back there, which we'll get into that in a second, but that's, that was his one, in my opinion, his only genuine feelings, that he did feel like he needed to go back there. But
I agree. And I think apologists say that, well, they were Americans. They were a part of they were an American protectorate. So we're freeing Americans. That's the objective here. Now, I get that. But the objective is to free Americans as rapidly as possible,
Right.
which means defeating Japan.
Right.
And if by bypassing the Philippines and getting to an actual strategic objective that's going to hasten the defeat of Japan, you defeat them more quickly, then you free those Filipinos more quickly.
Exactly.
And that achieves your purpose with more economy of force, with less loss of life. By the way, less loss of life of the Filipinos too, because the invasion of the Philippines, the Filipinos suffered more than the invading American forces suffered. And so, it was egregious from that standpoint as well. It, lacked a coherent strategy for why we're doing this. It was an emotional thing that we think we ought to do. It's right to do. But in fact, it wasn't right to do if it lengthened the war and ended up with more American and Filipino deaths, which one could argue it did.
It certainly resulted in more Filipino deaths. I mean, once the United States landed in the Philippines in 1944, the Japanese, they knew the gig was up, and they started slaughtering the Filipinos wholesale. And I mean, by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, and then by the more and more and more and more and more. And it was brutal. It was a brutal occupation. Let's be real. But that was the highlight of the brutality, was 1944.
But again, lessons learned, right? This is for looking to the future, not just the history. Is think really hard about what the strategic objectives are going to be to defeat the enemy as rapidly as possible. Not emotional objectives, but strategic, cold, calculated strategigic objectives. And there are many times during this war we failed to do that.
Well, and he's being, so in my notes for this episode, I know you saw it because I sent it to you. I said the petulant child versus the United States Navy. Right. And that's exactly what Douglas MacArthur was. He acted like a spoiled child when it came to any kind of confrontations with the U.S. Navy. If it being any kind of strategic plan, if it did not directly involve him or his people,
he opposed it.
He threw a hissy fit.
Absolutely.
He literally threw a hissy fit, would go into these, long diatribes about while he had to go back to the film. We're talking in 1943, when we were nowhere near ready to even get to the Philippines, much less invade. And just throws a temper tantrum over this consistently. He opposed.
Yeah, these things could not have been secret to his people, right? His people knew about this behavior. And what did they think of him?
They hated him. They hated him. I mean, there was a few
exceptions, right?
There were a few bootlickers. Sutherland
bootlickers is what Eisenhower called them.
Yeah.
And MacArthur needed his bootlickers.
Yes. Sutherland being the biggest bootlicker of them all.
Sutherland, right? If you weren't a bootlicker, if you were somebody who had any degree of objectivity about MacArthur himself, they were not fans of his.
No, Eichelberger.
What about Eichelberger?
Yeah, he comes to mind. Eichelberger is the gun that comes to mind the most. And then, of course, Eichelberger served underneath MacArthur. He had the unfortunate position of being underneath MacArthur. Eichelberger led, among many things, the operation against Buna Gona, which was a long, drawn-out, bloody affair. And it was a long, drawn-out campaign that Eichelberger personally led. There were many opportunities, many times that he was at the front lines, that he was, under fire from Japanese, that he did, see the elephant, as they said in the Civil War. He was there, he was a soldier's general. He was a guy who related to his people related to him. However, he made the mistake one time of getting his picture and his name in the paper. MacArthur sees this, goes absolutely berserk, calls Eichelberger in from the campaign,
from the battleground,
and chastises him over having his name in the paper, for Christ's sake, and threatens Eichelberger and says, I could have you reduced to colonel and sent back to the United States right now for having his name in the paper. Eichelberger goes on to say, and I love this because MacArthur said that he was the one that led the charge in Buna, that he was the one. It was he was directing the campaign, which of course he didn't. Eichelberger says this, and I quote, "The great hero went home without seeing Buna before, during, or after the fight, while permitting press articles from his headquarters to say that he was leading his troops in battle. MacArthur was at Moresby, 40 minutes away, and walked the floor. I know this to be fact," unquote. Mm-hmm. He was detested. He was detested. You know, a guy that we can talk about, and we will talk about, I know, in the future, is Admiral William Halsey. You know, Halsey was a headline grabber. He was a guy who liked to run his mouth. But in 1942, he got results. There's no denying that. 44, not so much. But in 42, for sure.
Halsey, and he was willing to laugh at himself. I mean, when he went to Guadalcanal, he actually went to the front lines in Guadalcanal. Yeah. And he said he shook like a little girl, that he lacked physical courage and learned something about himself.
Right.
And he was joking about this. He once dove to the deck on a ship when they were under fire, and a petty officer first class laughed at him. And he says, "What are you doing laughing at me? I'm going to promote you to chief petty officer. That way it won't look so bad at you as you laughing at me." So,
he had a sense of humor,
so
you know.
Halsey, and he was he's willing to laugh at himself. Halsey had his faults. We'll talk about him separately.
For sure.
But nobody.
Well, the point I was going to make is that Halsey, he met MacArthur several times, and he was afraid that when he first met MacArthur that he was absolutely going to detest him. And it actually, when they first met each other, it went pretty well, because they were kind of similar in certain ways. But after MacArthur took credit for a lot of the Navy's actions in 1942 and then in 43, especially around Guadalcanal, when Halsey was in charge of, when he was the man down there for the Guadalcanal campaign, Halsey referred to him, quote, as a self-advertising son of a bitch, end quote. So needless to say, the love affair between MacArthur and Halsey ended abruptly after that, and never, rekindled their one-time friendship. And it just goes to show you that he wasn't liked by anybody unless that person was being, treated well by him, Sutherland being one, Kinney, who was another one that was, a MacArthur file, a MacArthur fan, if you will. But
let's get beyond the personal foibles and talk about matters that actually resulted in loss of life. And let's talk about, let's say, the Philippines versus Formosa. There were two competing strategies at that point of the war.
Right.
One was to reinvade and reoccupy the Philippines, which was, if I encourage our listeners to look at a map and see where the Philippines lies in the Pacific, as opposed to, invading Formosa, as it was called then, Taiwan now. And, this strategy that was supported by the Navy, King and Nimitz, was to go to Formosa because you could actually attack Japan from Formosa. And the Philippines at this point in the war was relatively, we had starved, destroyed enough of the shipping that the Philippines could not be resupplied very well at this point. And we had destroyed much of the aircraft in the Philippines. We were able to destroy the aircraft to the point where the Japanese occupation of the Philippines was no longer a threat to the degree it had been, and neutralizing it was merely a matter of, fulfilling MacArthur's promise. Whereas Formosa was a leap point to Japan and much more effective from a strategic standpoint. But we couldn't do both. We didn't have the forces to do both, either ground forces or naval forces. We had to do one or the other. And what was the source of MacArthur's opposition to the invasion of Formosa?
Well, he wanted to go back to the Philippines, and like everything that he had done so far, if it did not directly involve him or get his wishes, he threw a tantrum. He opposed literally everything that was, well, I don't want to say everything, but he opposed the vast majority of things that were successful in the drive against Japan. Why? Because they did not involve him directly. He was the one, and I found this to be funny too. He directly opposed the island hopping campaign. It's on record that when the Central Pacific Drive, which of course was after Guadalcanal, they were going to move across the Central Pacific into the Carolines. The the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, not necessarily in that order, because the whole point was, of course, to put actual pressure on the home islands of Japan. Hence the reason that the Navy wanted to go to Formosa, because it was within striking range of Japan.
And his explanation was it was a war of attrition, frontal assault, and it was it was basically a revisiting of 19th century Civil War and Napoleonic tactics, right? And the result in unnecessary deaths. And then it was the exact opposite.
Well, and I find this to be, ironic too, as the Navy and the Marine Corps are leading the charge across the Pacific, and they started, New Britain, and then they go to Tarawa and different places like that, Kwajalein Atoll, not Eniwetok, but Eniwetok, and different places like that. The ultimate goal at this stage, of course, strategically for the United States Navy and the Corps, is to get to the Marianas. Why do you want to get to the Marianas? Do they hold some sort of resource? No, absolutely not. Their only reason for being a target is because of their location in the Pacific Ocean, and because of two things. One main thing is that it would put Japan in striking range of the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress. So this is where the United States Army Air Forces is really going to come into play in the Pacific War, because they're going to burn Japan to the ground. At least that ultimately became the tactic in which they used. And all of those raids, all of them, came from either Guam, Saipan, or Tinian, or sometimes all three at the same time, which are in the Marianas Island group. Well, MacArthur wanted no part of that. He could not, for whatever reason, see the actual strategic goal was to put pressure on Japan. It didn't have to go to the Philippines to restore some sort of lost personal honor, or soothe a guilty conscience, which is, I'm convinced, is what he had when it came to the Philippines. It was to, as you said earlier, to shorten the war with Japan by getting to the Japanese home islands, getting pressure on the people, the industry, the government, and ending this damn thing. That was the goal. So he throws a hissy fit. He has a temper tantrum after the Marianas operation when the Navy and Nimitz say, hey, you know what, our next target should be Formosa. So much so that at one point, I have it written down here that I had to take notes on some of this, because there's a lot of conversation back and forth. Oh yeah, here it is. If Japanese defenses were sudden, this is directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It says, if the Japanese defenses suddenly weaken, then the Philippines should be bypassed and an attack on Formosa should be launched. This is directly from the Joint Chiefs. This is an order, essentially. I mean, it's not an order, but it's as close as you can get to one. MacArthur flies into a rage, loses his mind in this meeting with Nimitz and other leaders, loses his mind, and says, quote, recapturing the Philippines is a sacred obligation, redemption of 17 million people. Something about he had blood on his soul. This is coming from Nimitz. This is what Nimitz took from the meeting, and says that the Filipinos were deserted by the American people, and that I shall be the one to go back and return their freedom. He had a guilty conscience, and he basically forces his will upon the American war effort at this point. This is something that we said earlier, by him saying, I shall return, it pigeonholed him and really the forces in that area into doing that one very thing. That's what he strove for the entire war up to this point. Where does this involve the United States Navy, the Marine Corps, and Nimitz? On a little island called Peleliu. The 1st Marine Division is deployed to Peleliu. They invade Peleliu in September 1944.
To protect MacArthur's flank. The invasion of the Philippines, right?
Supposedly.
And this is a Napoleonic tactic, even more egregious than he was accusing the Navy of with the island hopping campaign. The notion that his flank needs to be protected by taking an island that's hundreds of miles away from the landing area in Luzon and in Leyte is just ludicrous.
Exactly. I mean, Peleliu, again, look at a map. Peleliu and the Palau Islands, while they're, closer to the Philippines than are the Solomons, there's no doubt. What sort of strategic position does Peleliu hold against a landing that occurred a month later, mind you, in the Philippines? What does it do? It didn't do anything. You know what it did? It bled the 1st Marine Division white is what it did. And I mean, Peleliu is a mess from the get-go. But the main reason that the United States Navy and Marine Corps launched an attack against Peleliu is because MacArthur insisted, didn't ask, didn't request, insisted that that island be taken to protect his flank during an invasion of the Philippines, which occurred a month later. And
this is my point when I say that worst general since McClellan.
Yeah.
Decisions he made actively resulted in the death of Americans. And
Unnecessary
my argument,
deaths.
unnecessary death of Americans. And my argument is in the extension of the war. Remember that when Japan finally capitulated, the Japanese throughout, I mean, officially throughout the Pacific theater did surrender.
Mhm.
Okay. Now there were individual Japanese
Sure.
that remained until I think 1975 that didn't know the war was over, but they handed over their swords. And in fact, in the Philippines, it was to General Wainwright, the highest ranking POW in American history, 3-star, who was held in Japanese custody for 3 years and weighed about 115 pounds when he was recovered. And he's maybe 5'10". So the record shows that once the emperor surrendered, soldiers did follow the orders. And this would have, again, if we could have made that happen quicker, the war would have ended sooner, and more Americans, more Japanese, and certainly more Filipinos could have been saved.
Right. Right. And, you know, the return of the Philippines dominates everything that he does from 1942 when he bails in March 42 until October 1944 when he lands again. And you know, it's the one thing, and I said this earlier, and we said this earlier, that it's the one thing that I do firmly believe that he had a genuine desire to do, and it was, of course, typical MacArthur that it all focused on him. But you know, there's accounts of when he was aboard the USS Nashville during the invasion, the D-Day, you know, and he's standing there and he's watching American troops hit the shore, you know, landing and pushing inland. He's genuinely moved. You know, I mean, some reports say he was moved to tears. Whether he was or he wasn't, you know, who knows? It doesn't matter. He was genuinely moved by the sight of American forces returning to the place where he was essentially kicked out. Let's be real. Yeah, he was under orders, but he was kicked out. He gets into his LCM, his landing craft, and along with President Osamania, isn't it? And as he's heading ashore, he's literally, they said he was giddy like a schoolboy. You know, he was, you know, slapping arrow the guys on the back and couldn't keep his hands still. He was beating his knees, and he kept slapping Sutherland and saying, hey, you know, we're back. We're here. We're back. We're finally back. And he was genuinely excited about it. He was keeping his promise to the Filipino people, such as it was. So when he gets ashore, you know, and there's the famous picture of him wading through the surf. And, you know, there's a story behind that too, by the way, as he's coming up, as his landing craft is coming to shore, the pilot of the LCM calls the Navy Beachmaster, who was a lieutenant. And a Navy Beachmaster is God, you know, during the invasion. They can do whatever they want to do. And because they're trying to orchestrate some sort of, you know, organization underneath this chaos. And he gets a radio call and says, hey, you know, brass is coming ashore, make a hole. And he's like, I don't have time for this. You know, I'm kind of doing something right now. And
we're trying to get combat troops ashore and the supplies.
We're trying to win a battle here. Mm-hmm. And the LCM pilot gets back on the radio and says, this is General MacArthur coming ashore. And the Navy lieutenant says, and I quote, let him walk. So they dropped a ramp in the surf, and MacArthur has to wade ashore. Big deal. But, you know, that had to really piss him off.
He did make sure the cameras were on the beach before he
absolutely
record this moment in history, right?
So he gets there. And this goes back to the messianic, you know, feelings that he had about him and the Filipino people. And he makes this speech, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's ridiculously long. But he says, and I quote, he says, I have returned. Let's just listen to this, mind you. I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Filipino soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives and of restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people. That's not too bad. However, wait for it. Rally to me, let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. As the lines of battle roll forward to bring you within the zone of operations, rise and strike. Strike at every favorable opportunity. For your homes and hearths strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters strike. And the names of your sacred dead strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled. The guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. Sounds like the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like the Pope.
It's a religious fervor.
Oh, man. I mean, it just goes to show you, that at the end, even though he felt compelled to do what he had to do and to go back to the Philippines, and he pushed for it, and yes, it did probably cost, almost certainly, well, no, it certainly cost American lives that were unnecessarily lost. And I point to Peleliu because I knew a lot of guys that were at Peleliu. It was still at the end, it was all about him. Rally to me.
Compare and contrast. Eisenhower demanded with de Gaulle that he be allowed to deliver a radio message after the Normandy landings, and and that it was going to go to all French people. Mm-hmm. Compare Eisenhower's speech that he delivered after the Normandy landings with the speech that MacArthur gave. It's right. Like, one of the two of them was a real leader,
right?
And it wasn't MacArthur.
No, it certainly was not.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say let's start to move a little bit down the road, because we're starting to run a little long. We're good, but let's start to move on down the road, because once he gets into the Philippines, and again, this is a whole nother episode. Once he gets into the Philippines in 1944, he kind of is hands off. I mean, he exerts his influence here and there, but he lets his generals do what they're supposed to do. And the Philippines, by the way,
one would argue that he was hands off when the Japanese initially started attacking as well, because he didn't make sure that the aircraft were protected and things like that. But go ahead.
That is very true. But something that a lot of people don't necessarily know is that the Philippines didn't, the Philippine operation lasted until the end of the war. It went until August of 1945. It wasn't a one and done, and it was a long, drawn out, bloody campaign. But for the most part, he lets his people do what they need to do, and kind of stays out of it, really, as far as that is concerned. However, when the war is over in 1945, he resumes his place as the Messiah, as the one singular leader, and in so much that he is allowed to conduct the surrender ceremony aboard a U.S. Navy battleship, the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
He's the representative of all the allies.
Right.
And he refers to himself as the commander-in-chief of Allied forces during the surrender ceremony, which he was not
assigned. Exactly. Something was never given to him.
Yeah. And Nimitz, in contrast, represents the United States during that ceremony.
Right.
If
anybody should have been there taking the surrender of the Japanese, it should have been Chester W. Nimitz, not Douglas MacArthur. But after the war, he does do some. Now, we've bashed him a great bit here. We've really torn him down. But his post-war administration of Japan, Bill, talk about that. Let us know lay it on us.
I think he did it with grace, and it's shocking to hear me say that, isn't it? And he was appropriate in all matters. The book American Caesar deals with that quite a bit and covers it very well. The big question of whether or not the emperor would retain his position, in the post-war world, I think he was correct on that matter, and how the folks dealt with it, the transition, the restoration of the Diet of the Japanese legislature, and the transition of authority from the occupation forces back to Japanese government was done very, very well. Obviously, nobody could argue with the recovery. Right. Japan, sometimes you have to destroy something to build it. I mean, Japan is in far better condition economically, from an industry standpoint, today than they were even before the war.
Goodness, yes.
And so, and the Japanese government and its adoption of peaceful tendencies and its self-defense force, not its military, but its self-defense force, I think is shown that everything that was done during MacArthur's regime was correct and proved effective. He was a far better diplomat than he was a military general, in my view.
Oh, for sure. And that brings, I could potentially bring up another conversation, is that, you know, he had political ambitions for sure, you know, and of course he would deny it from time to time. But I mean, it goes.
But he never stopped it, right? And so when he was being recruited by the Republican Party to run against Roosevelt as an active duty
during the
Army
war,
soldier during the war, right? He never said, this is inappropriate. He's the commander in chief. I'm not running against him. He kind of underhandedly encouraged it. And only when he did something stupid and was outed unintentionally by a congressman did that star and that had a fade.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that he wanted to actually run against President Roosevelt, or it was talked about that he was going to run for president during the war. And, you know, a lot of what he did, one could say, you know, and his press releases, going back to what we initially said, the way he conducted things, the way that he was the Messiah, the way that he was the only one that was fit to lead, it kind of points to him building an image with the help
justify his election.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, again, McClellan also had political ambitions.
For
so
sure.
my analogy seems even more germane. Look through that lens as well.
Absolutely. So for all the good he does in Japan in 1945 and 46 and beyond, the next war, and we'll touch on this very briefly because this isn't a Korea podcast, but the next war that he has a finger in is Korea in 1950. And what famously happens, he's under orders from another president of the United States, that being Harry S. Truman. What happens? What does old Harry
Well, even
do?
before that, I mean, months in advance before the war began, U.S. intelligence warned General MacArthur that invasion was imminent. And he got angry, does this sound familiar, that these intelligence reports got to Washington, went around him. And he told the White House to ignore them, that they were not true, that could not possibly happen. And it was even several days after North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, he was still insisting that it was merely a probe, not to be taken seriously. This military genius, self-described genius, didn't know that the war was starting after it started. And it was like kind of, and just like, you know, it was just like the many times he ignored orders in the past and got away with it. There's another lesson. If you let somebody get away with something over and over and over again, don't be surprised when they do it again. And in this case, President Truman gave him a direct order, which he ignored, and finally was fired, in my view, 10 years too late.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, I mean, truth be told, he should have been fired in 1941, or at the very least 42. You know, when they pulled him out of the Philippines in March of 42, he should have been relieved of command and sent to do something else. I mean, this is not unprecedented. It happened at Guadalcanal, Admiral Gormley. You know, he just wasn't cutting the mustard, and they pulled him out and they put in Phil Halsey. But
you know, in fact, Stark before the war, I mean, no, after the war began, the president, quote, promoted Stark into the commander of Naval Forces Europe. Mm-hmm. So there are ways to get rid of people without embarrassing them.
Correct.
Right. And King became both CNO and Comanche, but that's another episode.
But it could have been done, and it wasn't done. And, you know, did it cost American lives? Yes. Did it cost Japanese lives? Yes. Did it cost Filipino lives? Yes. Did it get anything? Did it hasten the war to, you know, ending? No, probably not. You know, there's a lot of stuff that you could pin, you know, on MacArthur, and we could go on and on and on and on and on. But the fact of the matter remains is that he was, as you said, you know, probably the worst American general since George McClellan. He was not a tactician. He was not a strategic commander. He was not a leader. He was a liar,
He commanded by hubris and emotion.
Yeah. And which is not what you need to do when leading, an army or leading a strike against, a very powerful enemy. You need to lead with your head, not your heart or your whatever.
But, well, I mean, forget the military missteps. I mean, let's just on the personal behavior aspects alone. He's a pedophile, a known liar, a self-aggrandizer megalomaniac. From those, and from the pedophilia standpoint, he's a criminal. Mm-hmm. From those points of view alone, forget the military mistakes that might have resulted in unnecessary American losses. From those behavior aspects alone, I say to the city of Norfolk, you need to rethink your memorial to him. I say to West Point, is this a guy you want to hold up as an icon of military virtue? Yeah. If it is, we've got problems.
To that end, an icon of military virtue. I think a lot can be said about a leader or a so-called leader by the way your people respond to you, by the way they think of you, by the way they, do things for you, not because they're told to do it, but because they know it's the right thing to do, because they want to help you and see you succeed as much as they want to succeed and keep on living. There was a less than flattering poem written about General Douglas MacArthur during the war. And, of course, he never let this get out, but it was something that got out, and it did become to a point rather public, especially after the war. And it was something, and it goes like this. It says, Dugout Doug MacArthur lies shaken on the rock, safe from all the bombers and from any sudden shock. Dugout Doug is eating of the best food on Bataan, and his troops go starving on. Dugout Doug's not timid, he's just cautious, not afraid. He's protecting carefully the stars that Franklin made. 4-star generals are rare as good food on Bataan, and his troops go starving on. Dugout Doug is ready in his Chris craft for the flee, over bounding billows and the wildly raging sea. For the Japs are pounding on the gates of old Bataan, and his troops go starving on. That was written by some of the defenders of Bataan. Mm-hmm. And that'll tell you all you need to know about the way his people looked at him. And this is in 1942, but I knew a lot of guys who served under MacArthur in 1944 and 45 and 43, and they generally felt the same way. And that's not how you want to go down in history as any kind of leader of men.
No. And today he's buried in a grand 3-building monument in the city of Norfolk, a place that he never lived, but in a place that was willing to build this monument and memorial to him. Whereas Admiral Nimitz lies under a simple VA standard grave marker in the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Francisco. When you compare and contrast the contributions and the memorials that have been built for them, I see some inappropriate inversion there.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt. No doubt. And I believe the next time we get together, Bill, we're going to be talking about that very man. We're going to be talking about Admiral Nimitz, aren't we?
We are. I look forward to that because, it's hard to find something negative to say
for sure
about Chester Nimitz.
Yeah, he was a great man, great leader. And frankly, the reason, among the many reasons, but the main reason that we were able to defeat Japan in the way that we did in 1945. I'm good, Bill. If you got anything else, I mean, we could go on for days with this.
No, I think we made our point.
I agree. So we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast, and give us a rating and a review. We certainly would appreciate it. Also, and I failed to mention this on our first 2 episodes, but I'm going to do it here. If you want to see the video version of this and any other episode that we've done so far and will do in the future, subscribe to our YouTube channel called, ironically enough, Unauthorized History of the Pacific War Podcast. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. And once again, my name is Seth Pear, and I want to thank you very much for listening, Bill.
And I'm Bill Tody. Thank you very much, and hope to see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks. Y'all take it easy.